Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. Welcome to the Energy Transitions in Small Island Developing States and Fragile and Conflict-Affected Situations. I'm Samuel Tamiwa. I'm an advisor in the Sustainable Development and Climate Change Department, and I'm the chief of ADB's Fragile and Conflict-Affected Situations team. I'm always happy to be part of the Asia Clean Energy Forum. I joined ADB over 20 years ago as a renewable energy specialist, so energy is still part of my background, even though I'm no longer an energy specialist. I started the ASEF 16 years ago, the first one, and managed the first few. So it really is nice to be part of this event when it comes around. I'm here to introduce the topic and to provide the scenery, the background. And to do that, I thought I'd show a video and a very short video, just 2 minutes, and then talk about what we are to expect from the program. Over to you, Mr. Producer.
ADB's vision for a prosperous, inclusive, resilient, and sustainable Asia and the Pacific cannot be fully achieved while pockets of fragility remain in some countries. Issues such as weak governance, poverty, remoteness and isolation, unsustainable debt, extreme effects of climate change, conflict and violence, including gender-based and ethnic violence, are all causes of fragility. ADB's work in countries facing these challenges has been less successful when compared to elsewhere in the Asia and Pacific region. This implies that ADB cannot continue doing business as usual and follow the same processes, procedures, and practices in these countries. A new fragile and conflict-affected situations and small island developing states approach has been developed to improve ADB's operations and ultimately improve livelihoods, inclusiveness, and resilience in these countries. Our operations must remain agile, flexible, and acutely responsive, with the COVID-19 outbreak adding urgency to this task. The new approach is built on 3 pillars: improving ADB responsiveness, increasing institutional capacity, and enhancing understanding of developing member countries' contexts. Its underlying principles include flexible business processes, procedures, and practices, introduction of fragility and resilience assessments, context-driven and risk-informed decision-making, and optimizing adequate resources and strategic partnerships. Under the new approach, the way ADB prepares its country partnerships strategies, designs its projects, oversees their implementation, and sets and monitors its performance targets will be even more tailored to the specific context of each country. This means a shift to enhanced understanding of the context and adapting to it.
Thank you very much, and I hope that video was helpful to you. As you can see, I have it in my background here because it's really what we're standing to do. I think the point is that, as we work in fragile and conflict-affected situations and we work in small island developing states, it's really very important for us to really understand the context in which we're working, to understand the situation of each country. They're very, very different. We talk about small island developing states in the Pacific, and we may think they're the same, but they're really quite different, every single one of them. And so it's really important when we work there that we understand it. And that after you understand the situation, we really need to tailor our approaches. And I think for us as an institution, I used to be the country director in Afghanistan, and I used to complain that, we work in Afghanistan just the same way we work in China or India. In fact, we can't do that. We really need to tailor our approach and be very specific. And so this is why we have the FCAS and SIDS approach. And I sent a note to the speakers today. I'm really looking forward to hearing about their work and hearing about how they've been able to deploy the technologies, but also very interested in the process, but how they have taken the very specific situations in which they're working into consideration and tailored their approaches. Oftentimes, the biggest hurdles for working in small island developing states or fragile areas or conflict areas has got to do with the capacity of your counterpart, the capacity of the country, the governance issues in the country. Oftentimes for ADB projects, it's got to do with the procurement process, which is quite lengthy and detailed, maybe about financial management, and then also about safeguards, environmental safeguards, resettlement, and things like that. So I look forward to hearing about this from the speakers. and it's going to be a good session. And really, again, doing things while understanding the context, really tailoring approaches isn't just necessarily for small island developing states or conflict situations or fragile situations. It's really good development. And oftentimes we overlook that because we're pressed for time, pressed for resources, but we need to put that into our work. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Samuel, again, for the opening remarks. Much appreciated. And this is Jinlong Ma, and I'm based in Tianjin, working with APEC Sustainable Energy Center, and same time with Tianjin University. And once again, good morning, good afternoon, or evening, and ladies and gentlemen, depends on where you are. And welcome to the session on ACEF session 1.3. Energy transition in small island development states and fragile and conflict affect states. And as introduced by Samuel previously, and in this session, we have a focus on energy transition. Energy transition is a global trend, of course, as we all know. And there's a different issue involved and different dimension and different area to look at. And in this session, on the umbrella of energy transition, we look at some specific area, which means how to tackle the climate change and support the energy security and pursue sustainability. We have a special focus on an area, which is specific geographic and social economic characteristics, namely small island development states, SIDS, and also this with political and social conditions, some special conditions. We call it a fragile and conflict affect states. So with this two focus area, and we talk about energy transition, and with the aim to tackle climate change and support energy security, which more and more important. We have two speakers for this session, and I will have a brief introduction. Previously, I was thinking I will introduce to Samuel, but of course, Samuel already made a good introduction for himself. And let's introduce, hello? Yeah, let me introduce our first speaker for this session. And the first speaker is Dr. Chris Blankley, who is working with an international consulting company based in Australia, in Turo. Chris is a renewable energy expert who works in renewable things in different areas, particularly with expertise include prospecting and resource analysis of wind and solar. And his expertise also include techno-economic analysis, due diligence, and concept design. He has worked on development support and specification and owner engineer for different kind of projects in Pacific Island country and in Australia. And Chris got his PhD degree in aerospace engineering from RMUT University in Melbourne. And let's see what Chris have to say. Please, floor is yours, Chris.
Thank you very much, Professor Jinlong. Hello, everyone. The title of my presentation is Hybrid Power and Battery Case Studies in the Pacific. But really the focus of what I want to communicate today goes beyond the case studies themselves and goes to really some of the challenges that came up and the knowledge that we've gained through that and opportunities for the future. You've heard a bit about small island developing states. In this presentation, the case studies focus on the small island developing states of Cook Islands and Tonga. However, I think there's a similar story for many of the Pacific SIDS who all have, or I think all share very strong ambitions when it comes to sustainability and renewable energy. So my involvement in the Cook Islands started in about 2015. At that point, they were already well on their way towards I guess, a ambitious renewable energy program with some solar installed, and some of the outer island projects, some of the outer islands having already converted to near 100% renewable systems. However, the majority of energy was still supplied through conventional diesel generation, and a number of the smaller islands still relied on some very old diesel generation plant. Over the last 7 years, there's been a lot of successful projects implemented, including projects like Mongaya in the north here, in the top here, where solar panels and battery energy storage has been built on the island and used to supply very high levels of renewable energy to that community, backed up by some diesel generation there. On the larger islands, substantial amounts of new storage and control and integration has been added to support the development of additional private sector solar PV. And of course, there's very strong community engagement throughout this process, particularly on the outer islands, where it's I guess these changes are fundamental to their way of life. On Tonga, it's something of a similar story. We have a series of outer islands who are where projects are being implemented that provide electrification and reliable renewable power supply to those communities using solar and battery and integration. For the larger islands, it's a similar story to Cook Islands, where substantial battery energy storage and control capability is being added in order to support large-scale private installations of renewable generation. I've snuck in a picture here from Yap, from wind turbines, and it just really is an emphasis of, I guess, some of the similarities or the journeys that many of these SIDS will go through in developing high renewable energy or achieving high renewable energy targets. The transition that occurs is what I want to highlight on this next slide. So in a conventional electricity supply system, diesel generators at some sort of centralised or typically centralised location will provide active power along with a range of other network services to the network and through to the customers. And this is a relatively simplistic system compared to the sort of hybrid systems that are evolving as part of this transition to renewable. A hybrid system includes may include the conventional diesel generator plant, but it has a different role. We add in renewable generators such as wind or solar power. We add in storage to provide stability to the grid and to augment the variability in the renewable generators. And one of the interesting aspects of these systems is that it's no longer a central generator providing power through to customers, but this infrastructure can be embedded throughout the network, and power can flow in both directions as well as services. In order to manage all that, we need some very or increasingly sophisticated control and communications hardware to balance the power flows through those networks. So the transition from the conventional system to the hybrid system is driven by these three elements here: a desire for increased resilience for those communities, affordability of electricity, and of course, sustainability. The complexity of these systems, though, has its challenges. And some of those challenges have really been highlighted through the case studies that we've looked at. We've categorised these challenges into 3 streams of technical standards and procurements, and I'm just going to touch on a few of these in the time that we have available today, mostly around the technical and procurement front. One of the, I guess, most fascinating things with the projects that we've implemented since 2015 has been the really massive changes in technology that's occurred through that period, partly in control systems and integration of these renewables, but also in terms of the battery capabilities and the battery's capability to provide things like fast frequency response and grid forming for larger grids. Those changes have changed the way that the batteries are implemented in these projects. And they come with other changes in the industry, such as development of standards that help specify the performance of battery systems, as well as the fire safety and environmental impact of those. And of course, there's been substantial price reductions, which are sort of hit a bit of a pause at the moment, but hopefully they'll return to trend. Along with those changes comes increased contractor experience, which is great for servicing those markets. But there is, of course, an outstanding question about how best to service a relatively small market on a global scale with very specific needs. And we come to this a little bit in the procurement later on. One of the main challenges facing these projects, particularly in the early stages, is how do decision makers have the information that they need to design the systems, or how do they understand the technology that's going to be implemented? And the opportunity that comes out of this that I think we've tried to identify is a need to provide that information to decision makers in a very simplistic way. So I'm just going to touch on a few different decision-making tools that have been developed to support that process. First one here is designed to help decide between distributed or centralised batteries, whether you build a battery together with your solar generation or wind generation, or whether you have a centralised battery providing utility type functions. The decision tree aims to use easily available information to planners to go through a series of questions and answers and make initial decisions about whether there's likely to be more benefit in centralised or distributed batteries. And this can inform things like project specifications, scopes, land acquisition, procurement, planning, and so on. Another question that comes up frequently in these projects is, when can we go to diesel off? When can the generators be turned off and we run entirely on renewable power? It's a very complex question, and ultimately it gets informed by a whole range of detailed power system studies and the like. But for an early stage planner, that process needs to be simplified. And so this decision tree provides some information about when it's likely that a diesel off operation will be implemented, because of course that comes with a whole range of increased system support functions and CapEx that is required to enable that diesel off. And the last one I want to touch on is about sizing the battery. Again, this will come down to a detailed feasibility optimization, but there's some simple guidelines that you can use that relate to things that we know about, like what's the largest generator, or what is the capacity of the feeder where a distributed battery will be installed. The last element I just want to touch on briefly is procurement, which was, I guess, a major talking point for many of the stakeholders in these case studies. And one of the key requirements that those stakeholders are looking for is flexibility. So all these case studies were procured under standard Asian Development Bank procurement procedures. And I think the good thing to highlight here is that those procurement procedures do now provide the flexibility that's needed and adaptability that's needed to deliver these projects in a way that suits specific small island developing states. However, it requires early engagement and a real process of sort of working through this and developing the particular requirements for the country and the project. And some of those things are things like weighted qualification of bidders, including their ability to provide service in the local market and in the local area. Other opportunities, merit scoring during evaluation, consideration of parent company resources, and specifying particular equipment in some instances where that reduces O&M costs for the utility. For complex projects where we have, for instance, the development of a control system as part of the project, there is also the opportunity to introduce an early engagement with the contractor to manage the specification of that in a more cost-effective way. Thank you. So that's essentially it as far as the presentation I want to deliver today. But I do want to highlight that it's only a very small snapshot of the range of different knowledge that's been developed through these case studies. And just highlight that there is an upcoming ADB publication on exactly this topic on hybrid and battery energy storage systems, which I'd encourage you to look out for. Thank you very much. Back to you, Professor Jinlong.
Thanks, Chris. And that's quite impressive online. As we mentioned previously, our preparation, the time is quite limited to give a complete, more thorough detail of your work. But more or less, it's very much important, say, in terms of the technical issue of energy access and affordability. My personal background actually before and has involved in Pacific Island countries in different kind of assignment, such as this one in Papua New Guinea as early as the early 2000s. There's a geothermal in Papua New Guinea, the Here Gold, and also all sort of say electrification project in Papua New Guinea and in some small island country. It is quite important, I mean, say for us to shift the focus from so-called conventional power system to hybrid to a certain degree, but ultimately I also argue why not only hybrid, maybe in the end we move to pure renewable with the technology maturity of technology and the right policy in place, and there's a way to go. But for the time being, hybrid would be a possible solution, particularly for the small island countries, which is have some unique features. I did not mention at the very beginning. Normally, the small island country, they have a very sparsely populated residents, and they have a low economic activity and income relevant low, and all this need a solution. I mean, as Chris rightly outlined, the one of the solution of use a hybrid system to solve the energy access issue of this remote community. But other issue also is quite important. Maybe we can have a discussion session, such as use extend our grid extension to extend the distribution network. That's a way experienced in many other developing economy. We will have a discussion further on this. But all the questions, yes, include every panelist, and I will introduce our panelists later on. After two speakers, we have two panelists, and all the participants of the event have any question, and I think we can group together after this two presentation. And our next speaker is Dr. Bruce Robbins. Dr. Bruce Robbins is an energy sector advisor of Federal States of Micronesia, FSM. Bruce has a quite extensive experience in different sectors, from R&D at the university to government sector. And he's particularly has a strength in renewable energy policy development, energy technology transfer, and project management, particularly on, say, formalize national energy strategy. That's some work he did provide a consulting service for international development agencies. And he also has a lot of experience in Australia and other small island country, include Pacific and other island country, include this in the Philippines. And the presentation from Chris will be focused on the situation in FSM, of course, and for the situational background and the development and the potential and the challenge. Please, Dr. Robbins, the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen, distinguished guests. This is a presentation I put together entitled Powering the Federated States of Micronesia to an Exciting Future. This paper will address the current energy status and what the future holds for the most remote and isolated islands. I've tried to be positive in an environment where in the Federated States of Micronesia, the consequences of climate change are drastic. I'm looking at what will happen if we can all pull our weight together to achieve an outcome which will keep the global temperature rise to less than 1.5 degrees C by 2050. The isolated and outer islands of Micronesia face a significant challenge of delivering electricity to people living on the outer islands. On the 4 main islands in Micronesia, most of the population have access to electricity. However, on the outer islands, due to low populations, large distances, poor infrastructure contribute to these challenges. FSM is witnessing the effect of man-made climate change and bearing the financial impacts of these challenges. In these images here, we see what shoreline erosion through higher sea levels, higher spring tides, typhoons, etc., present to these outer islands. So what does the future hold? Well, as we said, FSM is highly exposed to the ravages of climate change, including sea level rises, increased ocean acidification, more frequent droughts, more flooding, and of course, more hurricanes. And these unfortunately tend to hit the western end of the chain of states, and that is mainly YAP. The human consequences for these ravages, particularly in the outer islands, is that they will lose their livelihoods, fishing, growing food. They have a deficient energy availability even for their modest needs. At present, there is increased health risks due to the polluted and often saline ingress into their potable water sources. Some of these communities, irrespective of what they can do, will need to be relocated to higher islands. And that has significant social, community, and disruption, including the local laws and local actions of these groups. Is there hope? Well, I hope the answer is yes. What the SFM has developed policies that will help to mitigate climate change. They also will have a significant positive economic impact by significantly reducing the importation and burning of fossil fuels. They also have a program of improving the efficiency of energy utilization, which has begun within the public sector and hopefully will be moved into the private sector. There's an increased adoption of renewable energy, both in the state utilities, who actually have responsibility for the remote islands. And the other aspect of the policy is ensuring the implementation of the FSM Energy Master Plan. Now, this master plan has been very successful in providing actions that have allowed the utilities to access significant amounts of grant monies. So if we just look at the Energy Master Plan and look at what's happening in the states, we can see from the master plan, already some of the states and FSM have achieved significant input of renewable energy into their grids. That's mainly on the main islands. And we're looking at investments of over 100 million US dollars. Now, focusing on the outer islands, there are essentially 62 remote populated outer islands with a total population of over 40,000. And the aim is for all them to receive electricity from renewable energy, certainly within the next few years, maybe 10 years, 15 years. We will need to install many renewable energy systems per year for the foreseeable future in order to meet the FSM's energy policy of 100% access to electricity. That is a major challenge, as you could imagine, for 62 remote outer islands spread over 3,000 kilometres of ocean. To achieve this, we will need grants from international donors totaling more than over 100 or 120 million. Now, one of the big successes has been the 2018 Energy Master Plan. As I mentioned above, has allowed the government to access more than 100 million from donors, most of which will be directed to the installation of renewable energy in the outer islands. I think, as mentioned before, one of the main issues is not so much the access or availability of money, but the remoteness, the cost of delivering and operation and maintenance, as well as the absorptive capacity of the communities. You know, the total population of FSM is just 105,000 people, where the majority of the population live in either Waino, the island of Chuuk, or in Ponape. So absorptive capacity is a major issue, particularly for having skilled people, and to one of the reasons why companies like Intura have become involved in a number of these programs. To give you an example of a remote outer island, this is in the state of Chuuk. The state of Chuuk, or Truck Lagoon, as many people know who are diving enthusiasts, is a large area lagoon with many volcanic islands. But outside of that lagoon, such as at Satawan, these are mainly remote locations within an atoll. And as we can see here, as we go from a top-down view to an area view where Satawan actually is, the community of Satawan, we see it as a elongated community, which has a potential for installing a hybrid system in the top of that island on the right. One of the problems with all the islands is land ownership, and it's the traditions that are associated with that. So most of the technology that will be installed here will have to go on or in government-owned buildings. The Satawan solution will cost more than $2 million. And it's based on surveys that were undertaken a few years ago to look at what the load profile is, what are the households, there's like 116 households, estimating the daily load and estimating the peak load. And what it looks like is we'll need to install up to 250 kilowatts of solar on the roofs of government-owned sites, and with a battery of between 400 and 500 kilowatt hours, which is around a 20 by 8 foot space, again, located on a municipal building. Small island developing states future is dependent on the world's most advanced societies implementing their COP26 commitments fully with increased urgency. And we can see here a flow chart of how that money should flow from the COP22 commitments to the small island developing states to the pathway that will allow habitat security and lifestyle protection. So what is the exciting future? Well, for me, the world that is habitable, sustainable for our children, grandchildren, and for many changes to come, generations to come. And as the President, His Excellency David Panuelo, said, our country program is socially inclusive, stakeholder-driven initiative, empowering us to work toward this new paradigm that will see the FSM not only survive, but thrive in the face of climate change. Surely this is an exciting future. Thank you.
Hi, thank you, Bruce. And that's a very informative and presentation on the situation at FSM. And as we all know, see, this Pacific island country and also some island countries, they are highly exposed to the impact of climate change. And also we all know, say, most of the small island country has a very ambitious target on climate change and renewable development. And they have a very, say, important goal to achieve reliable, 24/7 reliable and sustainable energy access to the broad community. It's the issue, particularly for the as Bruce mentioned, for the issue for the people living in the outer islands. And FSM has developed a good, policy and plan to mitigate climate change, which includes, reduce the importance of the fossil fuel, importation of fossil fuel, and improve the efficiency, and particularly with increased renewable access for both into the state utility and remote area. And he raised a very interesting topic, the role of international donor. And also there's a quite interesting area based on the literature and the report, and also some part of my experience, how to turn this plan to the reality, turn the plan to action. I believe our panelists and the audience and participant would also ask a question. Let's let's before ask a question to Chris and Bruce, let me introduce our two panelists. And the first panelist is Divina Chinkunako, if I'm spelling it right. If not, pardon me. And Divina has a very broad experience. He's currently the chief of the party of USAID project in Philippines, which is currently she's working with RTI International. And the project of the USAID is Energy Security Philippines, ESP activity, helping the Philippines mobilize investment and deployment of modern energy technology and support policy reformation for a more competitive energy sector in the Philippines. Her wide experience include electricity regulation and tariff setting and renewable and clean energy and climate change. Yes, welcome, Divina. And our other panelist is Dr. Salil, Dr. Sen. Dr. Sen has a very broad experience, and particularly say, working in a different area on institutional management and business management and international business. And who has developed some concept of sustainability seamless, which might be interesting to discuss with him over this discussion session. And Sahili's professional experience also includes, say, as a consultant working on water, waste, and energy. He has called a more interaction between this water and waste and energy. He received his PhD from Asia Institute of Technology, AIT, on international business. These are two of our panelists. I think at this stage, let's first get back to the two presentations. And anyone from our panelists have a question to the two speakers could raise a hand, and we can ask our speakers to respond. Anything from Samuel? Any consideration from you to our speakers?
None for me,
Divina,
thank you.
All right, Divina, based on your experience in the Philippines, how's your insight and suggestion and comments on the technology deployment, such as hybrid energy system, and also the policy, nationwide policy in the Pacific island country and other island countries? Of course, Philippines is one of the island countries we have to recognize. Please.
Yeah, thank you, Jinlong. I think I can really relate to the small island development states. Even if the Philippines is probably a lot bigger than them, we have 7,100 islands. So aside from the 3 major island grids, we have a lot of very small islands that, as Mr. Samuel said, would require very specific approaches because they have very different needs. And for Chris, I think among all the factors that you mentioned, I was looking at procurement, because for very small islands, it's very difficult to get investors interested because the cost will be higher. And I do agree with Dr. Salil. Based on our experience, prices or electricity prices in the Philippines become higher because of the remoteness, the lack of infrastructure, and possibly because the transaction costs are so high. Say, for example, boats are so small that they do not have the ability to really ferry, distribution wires, or you're faced with big waves, so you have to wait so many days in order to reach your destination. And the lack of capacity in remote communities is really a big deterrent. I remember we introduced a very updated technology on biomass. It was a very small biomass power plant that was tailored fit to suit the needs of the community. But it was technology driven. And the people that we train to operate the power plant was so hesitant to maintain and repair it because they were so afraid that they will just cause it to break down. So it's really capacity building on how to use technology and how to be able to upgrade, but bringing down the cost. In the Philippines, we've tried so many things, and in fact, we're so excited to hold our first green energy auction tomorrow. That's June 17. We're calling for 2,000 megawatts. And because the price of electricity is going up, we wanted this to be really competitive in the sense that we're putting a cap. The Energy Regulatory Commission put a cap on the price for each technology. We hope that whatever lessons we learned from the green energy auction, we would be able to apply to our small islands. I remember talking to some investors that while they believe that it would be costly to invest in small demand, if we can aggregate the load, meaning if we are able to find commonalities despite the differences and aggregate the loads, they may be interested to join the auction for off-grid areas. So I think for us, it's really exciting for me to hear the development in small island development states because I can truly relate. Thank you, Gilda.
Thank you, Divina. Dr. Sai, any comments or based on your experience in island countries, any comments on or question to our two excellent speakers?
Thank you, Professor Jinlong. I have really put on my student's hat after a long time. Trust me, rather than asking questions, I've made some very interesting keyword takeaways, starting from Ajahn Samuel. He mentioned a new approach. He mentioned flexibility, making it contextual with a full of each being different, tailor-made. Then we heard from Chris, the hybridity, the focus on affordability, sustainability, networking. We had also heard after that, Ajahn Bruce, he mentioned about the exciting future. Now, as a lifelong pursuant of sustainability, I would propose to this very august panel this concept of moving beyond sustainability. And there, my value proposition is sustainability seamlessness, which is, what is seamlessness? I have to define it in the context of small island states and also conflict affected states. COVID, carbon, conflicts, cyber wars, climate, so many negative C's impacting these small island states. So they have to cope with, number one, intense codependency between the marine, the terrestrial, the riverine, the desert space, island habitats. So in order to cut out the kinks and cut out the suddenness, I am proposing seamlessness, retaining their own sovereignty, retaining their own identity, and retaining their own innovative, integrated, resilient spirit. So this is definitely not a so hands-on presentation as I learned from the previous speakers. But in my 20+ country, moving around, doing some living labs on water waste energy, WWE, which again needs a little clarification, which means that each habitat is really a vector triangle. And a vector has a magnitude and direction. So the orientation would be different in Mindanao, in Geneva, in Redlands, in Xinhua or in Bangkok. So the role of a multilateral developmental institution would be to identify what is it that the particular habitat or the hinterland is looking for. So that's where I introduced this word of bankability, of seamlessness, with another new word. Trust me, I beg your patience on this. 2 new words already: seamlessness, bankability, and now one more, which is urbanization. This is, trust me, very potent, given the clutter in all these small island states, the conflict afflicted states. Everybody wants to sort of congregate into a very small part of the entire habitat. Bruce presented the remote islands, and so I had also worked with Philippines, the Ambition Natin with 7,000 plus islands, then in Georgia, in Sri Lanka, Vietnam, Maldives, Marshall Islands, Palau, and so on. There is a common need everywhere. One needs to be having this energy transition at scale, number one. It has to be affordable to the context, number two, and it has to be proactive with a sense of ownership, which is, I define as we own. And this we own really seamlessly aligns the interests of the policymakers, the local policymakers, then the processors who are oriented towards this disaster resilience, then comes in the ESG-driven financiers, and finally, the AI-informed community. Now, usually it is seen that they are not in the same sync. The purposes are different. So that's where the seamlessness would align them with a multilateral developmental institution like ADB would tailor make and identify what this particular habitat needs.
Yes,
I would leave it at that. Thank you.
That's a very much interesting concept, sustainability seamless. And we might have a further discussion if time allows, and in our next discussion phase. If you can excuse me. And I have a question, particularly for Chris. This BESS project, I believe most of the BESS you're looking at. Yeah, of course, you did a feasibility to consider both isolate project and grid connect project. One of the things in my mind is when you design isolate project, maybe use a microgrid. Have you taken any consideration into how to transfer from isolated project to the grid connect project? And for example, some experience can be drawn from such as Vietnam. Both Vietnam and also early state in China, they did very well to bring electricity to the broad community in the rural area. And they start with, particularly in Vietnam, they start with isolated microgrid or early stage, maybe a hybrid project, but they take consideration of grid extension in their design. They think maybe transfer this isolated project to connect the grid, power grid, distribution net grid extension. In your exercise in this island country, what's your consideration to balance the grid extension and isolated project? This is one question from myself. Another one is of course the cost of renewable has been down and down continuously down, and it has been technologically mature. I mean, solar and hybrid, even battery. Why the pace of penetration in this island country has been small? I mean, to bring more renewable to the rural community. What's the key barrier in these small island countries to really achieve universal energy access. Yeah, this my personal experience is again experience in Papua New Guinea. There's quite a challenging issue, but I'm still thinking from your experience, what's the key barrier, and what's the better strategy from this project, from the drawing board, to be implemented on the ground, and any consideration, say from regulatory issue and from the government. Other government issue, government policy issue, implementing issue, and what's the key area to be overcome? Chris.
Thank you very much, Professor Jinlong, and thanks to the other panelists too. There were very insightful comments earlier, which is really great to hear. So I'll try and answer the two questions, starting with the first question about where is the, I guess, balance or meeting point between isolated grid and grid extensions. And I think it's really very much a continuum and very customized for each situation. So for example, in each of the projects that I've been looking at for, say, the Cook Islands and Tonga, those communities are physically separated by the nature of their sort of geographical location. So interconnecting networks really is not an option for many of those situations, just due to the cost of sort of undersea cables and like. That's not always the case because, for example, in some of the Tonga outer islands, some of those do form like a small community of islands where we look at the options, or I guess the cost benefit between an isolated grid and an extension of the main grid out to those islands. There's another dimension to that, of course, which is within an island. Is there benefits within an island of, if we take, say, one of the small outer islands that, say, Bruce was talking about, we'd like to do a cost comparison between installing individual systems, like solar home systems on customers' premises, versus building a microgrid, a distributed grid for those communities. And the decisions there often come down to questions about the sustainability. How long can these systems be maintained and operated and run without running into that sort of cycle of neglect, if they are sort of responsibility of an individual versus responsibility of a community? So often those questions, this is certainly informed by the technical cost-benefit analysis of how much does it cost to run an undersea cable, how much does it cost to build a solar home system versus a distribution grid. But they're also strongly informed by what the community needs and how they expect to operate and maintain those systems, and who has the expertise to do that. So it's a very, very complex question, I guess, and it's specific to each project. I'll probably pause there, but we could talk about that one for a long time.
Please.
Sure.
Please go on.
No worries. The second question about why the pace of renewable generation growth in some of these small island developing states is perhaps not as fast as they would like. And I think the thing that always, I guess increasingly triggers this thought for me is that there's a lot of media around the fact that renewable energy is now much cheaper than any other form of energy. And so the immediate question you get is, in that case, why don't we just go 100% renewables and save these countries lots of money? The issues, of course, are far more complex than that, and I think that's ultimately what the policymakers and so on who have very ambitious goals, particularly early on in the piece, before there was a lot more widespread understanding about all the factors that, say, Davinia mentioned before about how do you, find contractors to work in these isolated grids, and how does that increase the the cost of energy for those suppliers. And if the cost of energy becomes more than what it would be under a conventional solution, then how do you manage to implement that project? Then there's the technical questions about how do you coordinate the balancing the load and the control systems and communications, particularly when you're perhaps on a larger island, implementing multiple projects through different processes, some through the private sector, some through the utility, some through grant projects and the like. It's really the complexity that I think ultimately slows down that uptake.
A quick follow-up to you is, what's the normal project business model? Because for many projects or sustainable energy projects, most of them, if not all, are funded by international donor or development agencies such as ADB, and I involve some from European Union. And in many situations, after installation, design, engineering, and some projects just go quiet. And if really to make contribution to for the energy from sustainable energy, make contribution to climate change to a certain degree, of course. And there must be a sustainable financial or business model to make the project set up and running. In your experience, what's the business model in this better business model in this Pacific or other island country to run this renewable project to make it really happen, and electricity from solar and wind?
It's a good question, and it's been evolving quite considerably during the time that I've worked in these projects, and I'm sure that others will, I guess, contribute to this answer. But I think when it comes to the smaller outer islands, there's one business model which is almost inescapable there, in that it's very, very challenging for those communities to be able to afford the full, essentially, infrastructure cost of those projects. So they can only really work under a donor type arrangement. And then the question is just, what's the cheapest way or most cost effective way of doing that? That also provides the lifetime of the project that we're after. So it's not just building the project, but providing the succession planning for training and so on to be able to run that for the whole 20 or 30 years of lifetime. For the larger projects, I think the business model that we've, I guess, focusing on at the moment is one where the generation side is built under private sector funding, because that's a very clearly defined scope of work that where it's possible to manage the risk for those contractors and get them interested. And if possible, if it can be done as part of a portfolio, so there's larger scales, larger volumes, more attractive for the private sector, there's a lot of benefits there. But of course, on the other side of the coin, the utility services to be able to manage that additional generation has to come from somewhere, and that's likely to be combinations of things like development support, or even just simply the necessary technical assistance and specialist advice that those utilities need to work out what they need to do to support private sector development. Yeah.
Thanks. I came a question to Bruce. And on your slide, I think it's page 7, there's a consumption mix of energy consumption in this other island. I'm able to see if I remember correctly. And the largest one will be household energy usage. And the rest include public usage of electricity or energy, such as schools, street lighting, and church, and some very small portion for the shops. I'm just wondering, say, this is basically the situation faced in some small island country. There's a very little productive use of energy or electricity, which means the purchase ability or willingness to pay or power to purchase energy is very limited. And what's the consideration to increase the productive use of energy or electricity in this small island country to really make, increase the scale of energy consumption, which means bring down the supply costs, because with the economic scale and larger size of the project, the average cost will likely go down. So any consideration from you when develop the national or regional energy development strategy to bring up, to increase, to support productive energy uses in this rural community, and any other things, because in many countries, economic activity is a drive for electricity and energy. With more energy consumed and the scale of supply will increase, that will bring down the cost of supply. That's a general rule. I mean, your thought on this, please, Bruce. Thank you. I think you should unmute your,
Yeah, thank you. Yes, I think as Chris said, dealing with these remote island communities is a very complex issue. In the FSM, the 4 utilities have the responsibility to provide the power and actually also water. Now, those the way those utilities would look at doing this would be to maybe combine a number of the remote islands into a group, which could then be addressed by a single contractor, for instance. In other words, giving it a bit of scale, which would offset some of the costs associated with individual islands. The other area, which we had a famous economist, Professor Gonski in Australia, who actually pointed out that the internal rate of return shouldn't be positive. It should be negative in order to take into account all the externalities that accrue. Now, that makes a big difference to the financial analysis if you move down that track. What it should be, I don't know. Maybe 5%, -5, -10, who knows? But the key to this, I think, is that the operation and maintenance, well, basically, as was pointed out, there is absolutely no way these remote communities can afford the capital costs. They're barely able to afford the ongoing operation and maintenance costs. And that is an area where the utilities in FSM have been looking at how they can maybe subsidize the O&M side of it in order to bring a price of the tariff which would be acceptable or absorbable by the remote islands. It should be pointed out that even on the grid, even on the main grid, there is subsidies and cross subsidies that occur. So I know subsidies are a bad word in the economic world, but in these remote cases, I think that they become very important. There was another point there I think you mentioned. I'm trying to, sorry, I've forgotten what the second part of your question was.
I mean, it's need a systematic approach to include energy and economic consideration to help to really achieve the poverty alleviation and increase the use of.
Yes, it's very important to, in the process of providing electricity to these remote communities, you are able to provide some sort of access to income generation. Now, one of the things that income generation is one of the things that when you're in these remote islands, which are very hot, and everyone has soda water or San Miguel beer, is that refrigeration becomes a significant impact. Be able to make ice or create refrigeration is a very good way for generating income. Potable water, to be able to supply water can become an income generating activity. There are two other very interesting activities which I know I think the Philippines have worked on, and that is if you can provide 24 hours of light, piglets grow, I think, 3 times faster. Chickens grow into chooks multiple times faster. And that has a big impact in terms of the number of cycles that you can generate. You can generate income from the sale of pigs or chickens or eggs. So there are a number of activities like that, maybe a bit more lateral thinking in order to achieve, but you're quite right. You need to be able to provide some income generation to the community, even in order for them to provide the cost of, even if it's subsidized, operation and maintenance. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Bruce, for the insight. And I'm looking at the question from the participant, and one of them is asking the situation of wind power in the Philippines. The question is, the gentleman or gentlewoman designed the power generation in North Province of Philippines, and the question from him or her is, how many wind farm is needed to sustain the energy demand, to sustain energy supply and satisfy energy demand in the province in Philippines? This will be will be directed to Devina. Before this question, I also have a couple of questions to Devina. I understand USAID project energy security in Philippines is currently support the Philippines conduct the first green energy auction. And could you please, Devina, I will share the experience and maybe some lesson when design this green auction in the Philippines. And follow up, this question is, how's the possibility or feasibility to implement this auction in other small island countries? Hopefully not too much. Thank you, Devina.
Yeah, thank you, Jilong. I'll answer the first question first. I think the size of the wind power plant will depend largely on the demand. So the first wind power plant in the Philippines in Ilocos was around, I think, 33 megawatts. That's the Bangi. But because of the off-taker, that was what the requirement was. Some developers would look at present demand and project to a certain extent. But the biggest, I think, if I'm not mistaken, is the Burgos wind power plant, which is around 150 megawatts. And for the Philippines, I think we're looking at now offshore wind. Of course, that would probably take years to develop given all the environmental concerns. But in short, the size or the capacity of a power plant will be largely dependent on the demand. On your second question, we have the first green energy auction. The Department of Energy is leading the green energy auction for 2,000 megawatts, looking at different RE technology. And we hope to be able to hopefully reduce to a certain extent electricity prices. I think that's a tall order given, how there's a lot of fuel shortage, fuel prices have really gone up. But we hope as we slowly develop, renewable energy and makes the Philippines more secure and reliable, considering that we are an island and we cannot import immediately, then we look at the first green energy auction as a part lessons learned. It took more than a year to develop. We had the Department of Energy to look at different ways or strategies, listen to developers, listen to stakeholders, and then be able to craft what they believe would be the most appropriate green energy auction for the Philippines. And as I said a while ago, looking at the green energy auction for the major islands, hopefully we will be able to look at the same principle, but aggregating the load for our off-grid areas. So I think we hope we will be able to give you very big news or great news after tomorrow. Thank you, Jim.
All right, that's a very much interesting. Another follow-up question to Devina is also Philippines has a quite good potential in general, and the similar things is how to really scale up renewable in the whole countrywide in the Philippines. Actually, one of the recent research projects we are doing here at APEC Energy Sustainable Energy Center, APSEC, is a scale up renewable energy across the APEC region. What do you think the role of private sector's participant? I mean, particularly to mobilize the investment for what's the key issue to mobilize the private sector in terms of renewable development in Philippines and in other island countries? Can you share some thoughts? The question actually I want to ask Samuel, but it seems he is not online. Samuel has a good experience on investment and particularly on this fragile conflict affected states. And you are in this auction, in the first auction in the Philippines. You must have some thought how to really mobilize the private sector's investment to help a renewable in the country or abroad. Thank you.
Yeah, I think the Philippines, 99% of the Philippines energy sector is really private sector driven. The government does not really own any assets anymore, except for the 1,000 megawatts Agus power plant in Mindanao. And I'd like to believe that the private sector would be modelized based on two things. One is there has to be an enabling mechanism, meaning, say, for example, a law. And that was started with the EPIRA, or the Electric Power Industry Reform Act, that privatized generation assets and transmission assets of the National Power Corporation. Then that was followed by the Biofuels Act, Renewable Energy Act, and the Renewable Energy Act gave birth to the National Renewable Energy Program, wherein there are specific targets for renewable energy. So I think, and that was complemented recently by the Energy Efficiency Conservation Act. So because it was a law, then the private sector now has a level of confidence that there's a policy that has been put in place. However, policies are actually irrelevant or not realized unless there are regulations in place. Like we have the Energy Regulatory Commission. So it has to be a tandem between policy and regulation. And hopefully we have the regulatory framework and environment that sustain and increases investors' interest in the Philippines. And we hope to be able to continue. Well, we have no choice actually, because the government cannot invest in the energy sector anymore. But we're competing with other countries with respect to private sector investments. So I think that for us helps us a lot,
Thanks, Devina. Yes, actually, this is a very interesting session, and there should be a lot of points to be addressed. And one of the questions from the participant, Lawrence, is asked the issue, how could this is addressed to Chris? The question is about how could a donor-funded project to be structured to address the risk, the cost related to, say, after completion of the project and the project go quiet. It's similar things where I asked Chris previously. And or some points in the future, could this project be privatized. I mean, that's the key direction to go. And what's the way to go to make this project really running? Yeah, after the donor-funded project, which you have to touch on, which I just mentioned. Say this is something very good. When we design the project, we design a business model, and when we find the right support strategy. One of the issues is such as in some utility, they set a tariff, they fix tariff. Another good example is some PNG Power in Papua New Guinea. They set the electricity tariff, say, from 2013 and fix the tariff until now, which to a certain degree prevent the new renewable project, particularly some of isolated project and mini and micro grid project. So this is some issue to be addressed. I'm not sure we have enough time to talk the regulatory issue for the regulatory body and to formulate really regulatory policy and to implement the policy to support the renewable project. This is very important to set a tariff, which Tavina, of course, is an expert in tariff setting. And another question from myself is to Dr. Sahil. What's your experience in this small island countries to have a integrated approach? Because as we all know, this SDG, yes, energy is one of the of SDG, right? Sustainable Development Goals, and in general, they have 17 SDGs. They are integrated and interconnected. And as some researcher has been analysis, most of the 17 SDGs are integrated with energy. What's your consideration? How to really achieve this, ensure access to affordable, reliable, and sustainable and modern energy for all from the integrated approach? That's which is some kind of related to your concept. I mean, sustainability, seamless. So any suggest or consideration?
Thank you, Prof. Jinlong. Yep, just a countdown to the session is begun, but I really was engrossed in the presentations. Yes, clusters of sustainable development goals is something which I worked on. And I was looking at the small island and conflict inflicted states. Energy could be contributing to number of sustainable development goal achievements. For that, I'll justify this point. Energy is not only serving the supply on the grid, but it enhances the end use applications. For instance, energy could be used for desalination, which is a very common situation in small islands. It can be used for food production, say aquaculture, which is also very much potent in this conflict-afflicted states, or even the small island states, or even the desert states, not aquaculture, but equivalent agriculture, food culture, fruit culture, etc. Then the ecosystem services, say the land and sea transportation, the transit, the sustainable mobility, maybe hydrogen fueled mobility to these states. One point I would bring up, yesterday I was listening very intently to the presentations where the affordability of this hydrogen, is hydrogen slated for the rich countries? No, it could be affordable. So the tariff setting, the price setting mechanism is a bottom-up approach in the spirit of we own. One last point, Prof. Ma. What we learn from these conflict-afflicted states or from these small island development states, can we configure, can we imagine a big country, a big habitat like China, India, Brazil, Europe, or US to be made up of small development states as well as conflict-afflicted states? It's a very practical thing I'm telling you. A big country can learn from this, and that could really navigate how to address because one big country can be clustered into these, though physically they are under one sovereign country, but they also have pockets of conflicts, they have pockets of isolation, they have pockets of in-development, inequity. So this is something our session, the small SIDS, can really feed in to the lessons for the overall picture. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thanks, Dr. Saeed. That's an interesting and very strong note for the small island country and the politics and fragile and conflict affected states to deal with energy transition. And I'm looking at the clock, and I was reminding that the clock is ticking, and also we receive quite a lot of questions, and I will take notes, and I think we can all see the question, and we can get a reply to this very enthusiastic participant of this session. Although we call it a small island, but we have a big thing to deal with, and let's maybe just use a few words and thank you for all the panelists. Thanks for the speakers. And that's a very interesting discussion. And for sure, so much for myself to learn and to understand. And it's also a good opportunity to network with the panelists, with speaker, and also with the participant of the event. And thanks for all the participants for this session. And maybe I just put a few conclusion mark for this session. And as mentioned at the very beginning, this session is about it's under the track of policy reform and energy transition. And we have a focus on energy transition and with a key geographic and social economic background to cover, which is small island developing as SIDS, small island development states and fragile and conflict affect states. And in general, and because we are doing energy transition research over here at the Tianjin University and APEC Sustainable Energy Center. And as we all know, energy transition is kind of response of energy system to the challenge of climate change, and also to bring electricity, more affordable electricity to the consumer, to the broad community, which means energy transition is one of the important way. It is an important way to deal with energy trilemma, which means affordability and reliability and sustainability of whole energy system or our society. The way of energy transition has a different dimension. And from the supply, it is a call for, it's a consensus for the call to transfer or transit energy from the fossil fuel-based system to clean and renewable and sustainable based energy system. In our case, that's our speaker has been mentioned by both Chris and Bruce. A renewable energy-based system is the way to go. And also energy transition happen also on energy transmission and distribution to make the power network smarter and more, with a more quick response and with larger capacity to absorb more grid connection of renewable. At the same time, in parallel with this centralized electricity power supply or energy supply, this distributed energy system, as we talked over the session, is very important to the rural community, to outer island area, to the rural area, because we all know this small island country has some specific characteristics, such as remote rural population and sparsely populated residents, and in some countries, rugged terrain and limited economic activity, as we discussed, and there's limited productive use of energy. And in general, beside energy, and this remote area and small island country, there are general lack of infrastructure So this all we need to handle at the same time to bring electricity, reliable, clean electricity to this island country, to the rural community. And of course, renewable is a solution, but how to say bring this solution to the reality is the challenge, is the things we need to consider. And I also saw the question from the audience on what is the real way to solve the problem. From the problem is we can consider from different angle. Of course, from the government level, and there should be a right regulatory framework such as tariff, and to make the energy system fair and just, and to really consider the cost of energy supply, and also as many developing countries have done, all this small island country and also FCAs need to formulate a right energy policy to take real consideration of local condition to their energy plan and policy. And another issue is to make the right choice of different technology. As I mentioned from the very beginning, ask the question to Chris, and make a balance, grid extension and centralized electricity supply to make a right balance of different choice, and also to a certain degree, as one of the first 1 or 2 tier of electricity access, we use a home solar system to solve the energy issue, to satisfy the basic requirement of this remote community. We need to find the right balance, choose different technology at different stage of electrification, and of course, scale up renewable application. This is very much the importance, the role of storage. Battery storage is one of the solutions, particularly with the maturity of technology and downward trend of costs. This is a promising part, the positive indication we can expect more renewable and to be installed and to utilize. On the downstream, and to make this project happen, need a right investment strategy. Right, sure. And the investment strategy covers the private sector and the public sector and the international donor, such as ADB and other multilateral. In general, a whole holistic approach needed to be, as Dr. Salih mentioned, we need to address the issue of energy transition to make the transition smoothly and to bring energy to the community in an affordable way. That's a couple of remarks I learned. And also, of course, a different mechanism can be introduced. From very beginning, government subsidy to bring renewable to the civil playground with the fossil fuel, use auction. There's a different approach or tools we can use to really scale up a renewable application and to achieve the goal of sustainable energy development in small island countries and in this fragile and conflict-affected country. And thank you so much for this very interesting discussion, and look forward to continue our discussion, maybe say email or other in other media. Thank you so much. And thank you also for all the participants for your patience. Hopefully we all learn something from this session. That's all from us. I'll see you from Tianjin, China.